We, the UCSC Ethics Bulletin, believe that the consumption of meat is not permissible in general. However, this is not to say that this is without any sort of conditions or exceptions. Now, for the last 2 decades, the meat industry has been responsible for the slaughter of 9 billion sentient beings every year in this country alone. Now, this means that on average, each American consumes 300 pounds of meat per year. Now, as far as loss of utility goes, it's quite hard to calculate each individual account of animal suffering within those 9 billion and those 9 billion each years and how much that accumulates over time. However, in terms of resources, we can calculate utility much easier. A recent NPR study, found that in order to produce a quarter pound of beef, it requires 6.5 pounds of feed, 53 gallons of water, 75 square feet of land, and 1,000 British thermal units of energy or heat. And now we're eating about 1,200 times the amount of that. If this produces a quarter pound of beef, we eat 300, then yes, 4 times 300, 1,200. That means we're eating multiple of 1,200 of all the resources that I just mentioned. Now, instead of these resources just feeding animals just so they can feed us, we could much easier have used the initial resources to feed the cattle. Instead of feeding the cattle, we could have fed ourselves. And instead of just feeding ourselves, in addition, we could have fed ourselves and those who actually starved to death in these years. So we can see a much more positive utility if we can feed those who are already being fed and in addition feed those who are not being fed. Okay, now not only were these resources used inefficiently, as in they could have been more effectively used to feed other people as well, these resources were also funded a considerable amount of animal suffering or suffering of sentient beings, which again is a great harm that I don't feel was necessary. Again, harm, in order to be ethically permissible, must not only produce a greater good, but it also must be necessary to produce this greater good. Now, to really get a better grasp on the numbers that I just listed here between all the resources and the amount of meat that each American eats each year, we have to see that from a USDA agricultural statistics department or study, we find that from 1970 to now, that the population of cattle or livestock started in 1970 as 45 million, and now due to our crazed consumption habits, we've limited the population of cattle to 2/3 of its population just 4 decades ago, from 45 million to 30 million. Now, the average dress weight coincidentally started going up as the population of cattle started to decline. And I find that there is absolutely no coincidence here, but complete causation and correlation. The average dress weight from 1970 to now increased from 600 pounds in weight to 800 pounds in weight, while cattle population declined in 60%. The dress weight or average weight increased by a factor of 25%. Now, actually, we can attribute this to not only the fact that our demand is unsustainable, but we can also attribute this to farming scientific methods or new methods. They're very cruel, including overcrowding, pumping these individuals with growth hormones, steroids, and antibiotics, to a point where they grow so fast that their bodies are not actually able to sustain themselves. They're not able to move. They don't even have the room to move, even if they were physically able to. And many of these animals are actually forced to live a completely functionless life, residing their own fecal matter. Now, this is um, absolutely suffering, and it's not very arguable to say that this is suffering. However, the real suffering, or a much more additional suffering, comes from the fact that slaughtering these animals actually requires a lot of energy. Whether it's electroshock or bolt guns or whatever, it requires a lot of energy to kill 9 billion things every year. So in order to accomplish this method in a way that's financially sustainable, basically farms have used or resorted to much cheaper and ineffective slaughtering methods, such as ineffective bolt guns and less than lethal dosages of electrolysis that send pigs into absolutely violent seizures, and bolt guns that leave cows completely conscious on their way to the slaughterhouse until the moment of their death, and an extraordinary amount of pain in both cases. Now, let's just say that what if slaughtering didn't necessarily equal suffering, and that world hunger was no more, so that essentially we have very effective slaughter. The animals don't even feel any pain throughout death, and that our resources couldn't go to any sort of better cause because everyone's already being fed, and we can't see a gain in positive utility if we're not taking away from something that's bad, like hunger or starvation or death. So, what then would be our argument if we have accomplished ending world hunger and accomplish more effective slaughtering techniques? Well, we still have to look at what possible utility is there to gain from eating meat. A recent Cornell-Oxford study found that animal proteins were the most toxic of nutrients. Yes, it is a nutrient. Yes, you will live off of it longer than if you lived off of nothing to eat. So it is a nutrient. However, of all nutrients, it gives us the least amount of positive utility. And in fact, it is of the nutrients, it's the only nutrient that I can think of that can actually lead to negative utility. Now, animal proteins are so high in acidity. They raise the acidity in our blood in order to break them down. Now, in order to restore our blood's fragile pH balance and lower the acidity rate, it requires drawing calcium from our bones, i.e., consuming animal proteins deprives us of calcium, leads to osteoporosis, and other matters. However, so arguably, there's very little to no utility from nutrition. However, there is other utility that would derive from eating meat, such as pleasure. But is pleasure really worthy of ending a sentient being's life over, even in the absence of suffering? Even if there's no suffering, is our pleasure that we derive from eating meat truly worth ending an animal's life? It's simply not. I can tell you that for sure. And that, frankly, even this isn't the case that even if we do have these models, secondly, this model doesn't look that I presented about completely effective slaughtering techniques and no world hunger. This is not even close to reality. This is an alternate universe. We're talking about applied ethics, not the theory, strictly the theory of ethics. So frankly, I'm not too concerned about this. Now, eating animals is typically bad for everyone. However, owning a pet is nothing special. Addressing the question about pet owners now. Now, the obligation, we find this because the obligation of a pet owner is to the pet, not to the species of animals in which its pet particularly belongs to. For example, it is absolutely ethical for a dog owner to essentially scare or use some sort of defense-based violence on a pet or on a dog, or basically if the pet owner is an owner of a dog and the neighbor's dog comes running after his pet, he has every right, ethical right, to defend his dog because he does not have an obligation to all dogs everywhere. He just has an obligation to that pet. He has made that pet trust him, and vice versa. There's some sort of contract between the two. However, that dog down the street has no trust, no knowledge myself. We have no sort of understanding. And I frankly do not find it inconsistent to protect my dog over another dog. Ergo, pet owners' responsibilities are due to their individual pet, not the species of pet. This is similar, again, with parents. Parents do not have a responsibility to all of humankind, but particularly their child, or at least their child first and foremost. Now, a counter to our argument in general would be that chicken on the road. If you find a perfectly edible chicken on the road that's dead, that can't feel pain, didn't feel pain, would it be ethically permissible to eat it? And a lot of people say that it would, and we found some sort of loophole. But again, this is not applicable. I'm not talking about every single situation ever. And if we did find this animal on the side of the road, unless there was a serious utility to be gained from it, then I don't see this as good, because the bad is that you're perpetuating an unethical culture in which supports of the meat industry, which supports animal suffering and animal slaughter. And the utility that you would have to gain from it would have to be saving your life. But frankly, unless you're starving to death, you're otherwise putting in an unnecessary toxic nutrient into your body, in which you could much better serve your body in almost the consumption of almost any other nutrient. So, however, this leads me to being stranded on an island. If you're stranded on an island and you are going to die, I believe it is ethically permissible to eat an animal. The utility of your life being sustained and all that you can sense, all the utility that you can sense and all the utility that the world can receive as a result of you being alive absolutely trumps the loss of utility from the animal that had to die to give this. And again, even if it's with your pet dog, I still believe that it would be ethically permissible if it was necessary for the greater positive utility of your life. Now, the counter two is that animals' only utility is to be consumed, and that not consuming them is a waste of utility. And frankly, this is not the case. Animals are an absolutely vital player or role in our fragile and crucial ecosystem. However, I don't even have to go into the utility of animals to understand that our real loss of utility here is the crops and resources that we use to feed the cattle instead of ourselves. And again, so we find that there is ultimately no argument that upholds or asserts eating meat as necessary. And we have underlined the harm that does come from eating meat. We have absolutely outlined other options, such as to eating meat. Being an herbivore, you can possibly gain all the nutrients very easily, or just as easily, even more easily, than we do so from eating meat. Because conscientious omnivorism or herbivorism or veganism is so viable and equally reasonable, if not more reasonable, than eating meat is not necessary. Eating meat does create harm, and because it's not necessary and it creates harm, it is not ethically permissible.